Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you all for making the time to attend this session. I'm talking about a topic which is very close to my heart, so I want to kind of take this a little bit slowly. And if there's any questions that you all may have, please feel free to raise it. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible as we go through this material. Just move on to the next slide. So I think I do not need to at this point explain to all of you how important open source software is in the world at large today, and also in the industry, right? Because I'm sure if you look at some of the logos that you're seeing on the screen right now, I'm certain that almost every one of you would have at least worked with at least one of these technologies, if not more. So at this point in time, open source and free software has reached a point of being all pervasive, and it's so prevalent in the industry that you cannot ignore it. So I just want to give a little bit of that context, just to keep things in context, how valuable open source and free software is for the work that we do, whether it's in academia or whether it is in industry. It doesn't matter. We're going to be using lots of open source software almost on a daily basis, right? So I want to keep that in context, because much of my talk today is centered around why is it important for you to contribute to open source and get involved in open source, and how it can benefit you individually as you get into the industry, right? And I'll use a few personal anecdotes also to kind of relay that point, because I think it's important. Now, when it comes to open source, I just want to maybe define what it means and also kind of set things a little bit in context. Fundamentally, it's about the ability for us engineers to be able to view the source code, study them, be able to change it, and also be able to distribute it as in how we see fit. The freedom to do that is what we essentially call open source. And over the years, there's a lot of mechanics that have been used in order to make this source code open, and a lot of it revolves around copyright law, which has been used to basically be able to, within a legal framework, be able to open up the source code and to give you the necessary freedoms to be able to do what I just mentioned, the ability to study, to change, and to distribute. And so what you see on the slide right now is a list of licenses that would be used or can be characterized as open source licenses. Now, of course, the freedoms of each of these licenses and what they give you as a developer varies from license to license. So if you want to think of it as a continuum in which you would talk about permissiveness on one end and freedoms on the other end, right? You'd have these licenses fitting into that continuum at different places, right? And so, for example, you got, I'm sure you must have heard of licenses like the Apache license, the BSD license, or the MIT license, which are highly permissive licenses. And they fall into the category of permissive licenses, which allows you to pretty much do all the things that we mentioned, the ability to view the source code, study it, change it, and also it's highly permissive from the standpoint of being able to commercialize it, right? And so that is one family of licenses. Then you've got another family of licenses relating to the GPL family of licenses from the Free Software Foundation, which also focus not just on the availability of source code itself, but also safeguarding some interests around making sure that any derived works based on the source code of a software that is licensed under a GPL-based license is also extended to those who derive additional work based on those licenses. So it's a way of, permeating the freedom that you receive and making sure that downstream individuals also kind of can make use of those same freedoms. So that's a broad landscape of the different licenses is available, and how it fits in the broad scheme of this continuum of freedom that we're talking about here. Now, when it comes to freedom, I want to kind of take a little bit of time to explain that there are some nuances with respect to some of these terms that we're talking about here, right? So, for example, I want to disambiguate and clarify the differences between what you mean by open source versus free software versus freeware and versus public domain. So when we're talking about the ability to read, study, view source code, it falls broadly under the open source umbrella, and there's a certain definition that OSI, the Open Source Initiative, has defined on what can fall into this category that we call open source, which is elaborated in the definition of open source. So that is one way to kind of think about this. Then when it comes to free software is a much broader view of the same concept, but it also applies not just the ability to view the code and work with the code, but also encompasses certain fundamental freedoms that must go along with it, right? And so that's where what I mentioned you earlier in terms of the how derived works based on free software or GPL licensed software must also have those same freedoms extended to people who might get it after you. So it kind of, in one sense, it is also known as a viral clause, right? Where the virality we're talking about is fundamentally ensuring freedom. So I don't think it's not necessarily a bad thing or seen in a bad connotation, but it does pose challenges to companies who intend to take open source and make commercial products out of it, right? And so that's where one aspect of this license may be problematic in certain scenarios. Then we have the notion of freeware, which is basically software that is given away for free. Now, things that you can download from the internet in binary form that you can execute, which doesn't have a price associated with it. Now, even though it doesn't have a price associated with it, doesn't mean it's necessarily free software in the definition of what I mentioned earlier, where with respect to the freedoms of what you can do with it. Because you may get the software for free, but you may not get access to the source code or the ability to redistribute or the ability to change and tinker with it. So those are freedoms you don't get with freeware, even though the term free is used in the definition of it. So that's how you would differentiate, what is freeware versus what is open source. Then you've got public domain, which is basically software or anything really that is not legally encumbered, by any intellectual property rights. So literally you could do anything you want with it, but that also means it does not have certain protections with respect to patents and things of that nature. And this is completely, in the public domain, which means there's no restrictions in terms of taking any public domain assets and commercializing it. So if you want to look at it on the spectrum of permissiveness, public domain, you could say, is the most permissive because there's no encumbrances whatsoever, right? And everything is in the open. So I hope that helped disambiguate these terms a little bit, because it's important to kind of understand the nuances of this and what it means with respect to the fundamental freedoms that we're talking about that you get in each of these categories. And it's also important when you figure out and when you're looking to basically contribute, because some of these categories also have implications on what it means for your contributions as well. So if you just take the last 20, 30 years, open source and free software thinking has been there, since 70s and 80s, largely in smaller circles back then, mostly around academia and such. But since the 90s, it really caught adoption or grew in adoption because of things like Linux, which really brought the concepts of free and open source software to the masses to some extent. But in the early days, it was still very much not for everyone. And it was mostly relegated to smaller groups and almost seen as a rebellious rebel outfit in the broader scheme of things. But slowly and surely, as the decade progressed, more and more adoption happened, and free, and open source replacements for commercial products began to come up, and subsequently business models and enterprises started using these models, using this software to build companies and businesses. A good example in the Sri Lankan context is WSO2, and it's a very good success story of how this model has been used successfully to build very successful commercial enterprises. And at this point in time, we've reached a point of almost mass adoption, and to the point where it's all pervasive, and open source has literally taken over everything. So when you're building, when you come into the industry from academia, you will realize that almost everything you do will end up touching some aspect of software that is open source, right? And it's hard to avoid that. And I think part of my message here is, by getting involved, at an early stage in contributing to open source and also being part of those communities, will help you build experiences and capabilities that are very valuable when you get into the industry, right? So I think that's the primary message I want to bring out. But I want to lay it out in this context where we started off with, very niche adoption, very in the early days, but at this point in time, it's all pervasive with mass adoption, both in commercial and enterprise circles as it is in academia. So what is the benefits? What are the benefits you get with open source? I'm just going to go through a few points, right? Fundamentally, the abilities it gives you and the benefits you get, is the ability, if you're an engineer or someone with an engineering mindset, you'd always want to lift up the hood and see what's working under the hood, right? And open source always gives you that ability to be able to open up the hood, see what's going on, be able to tinker with it, make changes, see how things work, right? And make enhancements, and then also give you the ability to contribute them back into the community, and also use those same abilities to kind of commercialize, build products, and even startups around those open source software, right? Is another ability you get. But I think the most important one, if you have an engineering mindset and an inclination, is the ability to build skills and to be really great at something, right? And it would be this, I feel, is the most important and the most the biggest benefit you're going to get by working with open source. And if you really want to build skills, that are going to be of value when you get into the industry, this is one way to do it. And I will talk a little bit as we progress in this deck about how you can get started. So as I mentioned, we use free and open source software on a daily basis, right? From the time you check your email to time you check the day's news, right? If you're using an Android phone, if you're using Firefox, if you're sending an email, if you visited a website, you've used open source software, right? And if you've purchased anything online, you used open source software. And all of this software is maintained by volunteers, right, around the world. And at some point, the question may come up, hey, how can I give back to this community, right? This community that has given us so much, how can I give back to this community? And contributing back to open source, working on open source projects, getting, making your contributions in, that's one way to give back to the community. And that is the most primary way to give back to the community. It's also a great way to make an impact, because if you take some of the most popular projects out there, Nginx, Apache, Kubernetes, if you're able to contribute to those projects, what you contribute will be working on millions of servers and machines and be used to handle millions of dollars of transactions on a daily basis. So what you do has a real tangible impact, right? So if you want to be part of that and want to make an impact, this is another way to do it. And I mentioned, part of the allure of working with open source is to be able to build skills, right? And one of the ways you can also do this is open source communities opens up the ability for you to interact with extremely talented people from across the world, right? And if you really want to look at your the 5 people that you interact with on a daily basis and say, how do I increase my overall average? Because you tend to be the average of the 5 people you most interact with, right? If you look at it from this lens and this context, this may be another way for you to increase that overall average. You can work alongside some of the most smartest, most talented engineers, from the Googles, the Microsofts, and then you can really open up your eyes to say, hey, what is it that, why is it that they can do this, and why not me, right? And I think it'll also open up questions that may help you figure out areas that you need to develop, right? In terms of your coding skills, in terms of your system design skills, right? And so one way of really opening up yourself to the areas that you really need to improve is by working alongside extremely talented individuals from across the world, which will really push you, right? Push your limits, and it can also motivate you to kind of develop the kind of skills you need in order to play at the same level, right? So I think this is a great way for you to put your own self in context and also gain confidence as part of that process. So I think this is a very important element of why you should contribute to open source projects, because this is, if I were to say, the most important benefit you're going to get from doing so. And the confidence you get and the abilities you get by doing working in such a manner directly translates into the industry, and it'll make you a more successful engineer. It'll help you scale up organizations, and so it's a highly sought after skill. So I hope this message comes across strongly to you. The other benefit is much of the new capabilities and much of the new practices that makes its way into enterprises and originate in open source environments and circles. So when you're working alongside these talented individuals, leveraging cutting edge practices, right? You are proactively building skills that will make you successful once you get into the industry, right? And some of these skills are not always technical skills. They're also soft skills, right? And these soft skills, if not just as important, are sometimes more important than the technical skills, especially when you get into the industry, right? the abilities to work collaboratively in teams, the ability to be able to influence others with your point of view, persuade, being able to take initiative, demonstrating leadership. All of these things are elements that you can practice within your open source circles, being able to push your agenda in terms of a feature or a enhancement that you wish to make on a certain framework or a library, right? And being able to do that collaboratively across globally distributed remote teams, right? That's the kind of skill that industries really look for, right? And then also being able to work with different types of individuals, which may pose challenges in certain times, but those are the kinds of experiences that you're going to need when you get into the industry. So that the ability to be able to handle various kinds of feedback, right? And then as you get through this process, you'll also start building confidence in your own abilities, right? And at some point, that will give you the kind of confidence you need in order to further build your skills and be successful once you get into the industry as a whole. And all of this can prove to be a portfolio of work that is extremely useful for a potential employer. For instance, as an employer, if I have a few CVs in front of me, and one of the CVs indicates a rich contribution to open source projects, possibly even a committership in a popular open source project, right? I would not hesitate twice to make an offer to an individual like that, because to me, those bring out signals. Those are all good signals of what kind of an individual that person is. For instance, if that individual has committership access to a popular project, I know for a fact that person, that individual, he or she has consistently contributed to that project over a period of time in a sustained manner, in a manner that gave confidence of that individual's abilities to a much wider group of people, who have then entrusted that person with committership, which means the person is able to work in teams, be able to build rapport, is collaborative, demonstrates those abilities, and demonstrates a level of passion to be able to do that on a sustained basis, possibly using his or her own personal time, right? Those are all good signals to me as an employer that would make that particular profile stand out from the rest. So if you want to differentiate yourself coming out into a competitive job market, this is another way for you to do that, right? It also helps you build a reputation and also be seen, and also to help you brand yourself. So all of these are good elements that you should think about as you're considering why you should contribute to an open source project. Personal story. This is also a great way to find a mentor. So what you see here is Nibe, who was my mentor when I was trying to get into the Debian project, and who helped me along the way. Fantastic individual, learned a lot from him, right? And so this is also an opportunity for you to work with some really talented individuals from across the world, and seek mentorship, right? And an important element of that is once you do that, you should also not forget to give back to the community, right? And this discussion is part of that, at least as far as I'm concerned. But that's another element of this that I want you to keep in mind, because this community is filled with some great people who are always open, who help when asked for. All you have to do is ask, right? I think that's the important thing. Sometimes we shy away from asking, but you will never get a no if you were to ask, right? So the other benefit of this in this whole contribution to open source is being able to work with such people and to learn from them, seek their mentorship, and develop your own selves along the way, and at some point give back to the community. Another aspect of this is really being part of a movement. As I mentioned, free software is not just about price. Free, we are talking about is not just price. It's about a freedom, which is, you want to think of it as a fundamental right, right? And that fundamental right is the fundamental right to tinker, fundamental right to see under the hood, fundamental right to be able to change things and be able to share with your friends. That's the fundamental right this movement is about, right? And if you're an advocate for it, you know, it's a highly fulfilling experience because you get to work with very varied but extremely passionate group of individuals from across the world who care about these rights, right? And who will fight very hard for it. Who you see on the screen right now is Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman is the president of the Free Software Foundation. He's been a staunch advocate for these freedoms for many years, and he's a very popular and sometimes controversial individual in the industry. And say what you will about him, he's a very passionate man, and he fights for these freedoms. And if you're interested in being part of this thought process and this way of thinking about software, you should read up on Richard Stallman. You should look at what the Free Software Foundation does, and see the contributions that Free Software Foundation and free software has given to the industry over the last 20, 30 years. And the contributions are immense. And suffice to say, you know, this world would not be the same if it weren't for free software and GPL and all the work that Stallman and Linus Torvalds and the other luminaries have done over the last 20, 30 years. Definitely it would have been a completely different world. So what I also invite you as part of this whole discussion is to read up on this if you're not familiar, or if this is the first time you're hearing about this, right? And understand that it's not just about the ability to read the code of what we are building. It fundamentally talks about a set of fundamental freedoms, which is what is encapsulated in this movement. So happy to answer any questions if you have offline. But what I invite you all to do is, you know, join and be a part of this army, right? Because this is if you're into software, if you're into IT, you know, this is one of the better places to be, because if you have an engineering mindset and an inclination, this is a great way for you to get all the benefits that I just mentioned to you earlier, right? And develop your skills and prepare yourself as you get into the industry. So let's talk a little bit about how to get started. The first thing is to really think about what is the area that interests you deeply. What is the area that fascinates you, right? That you're really passionate about, that you want to learn, that you want to become really good at, right? And it could be more than one. It could be, you know, for instance, compilers, operating systems, languages, specific frameworks, right? Tooling, techniques like machine learning, could be anything, right? And this is the part where you gotta introspect and then figure out what is the area that you really want to play in. And it's important to tie this into an area which you feel passionate about, because that's going to be a significant motivator for you and help you progress and keep pushing when maybe things get a little bit hard. So I would say find that area first if you haven't already, because that's going to be important. And then once you do, you know, dive into the code, right? In almost all of these areas, you have projects which are open source, which you can get started with immediately, right? All you have to do is go to github.com/topics, search for the specific topic of interest, start exploring the different projects, right? And if you know a project to begin with, like for example, if you're working with compilers and you want to know how GCC or Clang works, right? You can go directly into those projects because they're already open source, highly used in the industry, right? And start opening up the hood, download the code, build and run it locally, dive into the source code, try to figure it out. This is the fun part, right? Diving into the code and trying to figure it out, right? Once you've gotten to some level of proficiency in being able to build the code, run it, make slight changes, modify various things, and then see it in action, then we should head on to the GitHub or whatever bug tracker that project has, and then look at a good issue to contribute. Take a simple one. In GitHub projects, usually most open source projects have a specific tag. Maybe it's called a good first issue or a newbie, or it could be, it varies from project to project. But find that tag for that particular project. Look at a few defects and see if you can fix one of them, right? That would be a good first time contribution. And attempting to fix a small issue, will start you through the process of learning how to work with the source code, navigate the code, understand the data structures, and what you need to do to make changes. And so that would be a good place to start. And then once you've done a fix, you've tested it, you've validated it, then you want to contribute back to the community. So you would get the repository, fork it, and you might have to, in certain cases, in certain projects, you might have to sign a contributor license agreement in certain cases. And sometimes if that is a problem for you, or if you feel maybe I shouldn't do that because I don't want to sign away my rights, I'd rather contribute to a GPL or a BSD project, for example, then that might be a point of decision for you, right? But in certain cases, you might choose, hey, let me just contribute this because it's an important project and I use it on a day-to-day basis, and I'd rather be a contributor to this. In such a case, go ahead, right? And make that contribution. And then all you do is push your changes into your repository, do a pull request, and you've made your first contribution, right? And it's as simple as that. And sometimes it's not just about code. Sometimes you can get started with documentation, or you can get started with test cases, right? So it doesn't necessarily always have to be code or deep in the guts of the framework. You can start in the periphery and slowly work your way in as you get more and more better with that particular framework or project. But the important thing is persevere. It requires perseverance. It takes time. Sometimes you just need to spend some time with it, a few months, maybe a few years, right, before you get really good at it. But I think it's important that we invest that time, because after that necessary time, a few months, maybe a year, you'd have some really solid skills that you wouldn't have otherwise had if you hadn't gotten involved in the first place. So and that is of high value when you get into the industry, right? So perseverance is also key, right? And it's not just a one-time contribution and you're done. You got to persevere, spend the time. Sometimes you need to do a little bit of time in order to get really good at something. And if you really want to be good at that one thing, then that investment is needed. And but the payoff of it is going to be very good. So make that investment and push yourself. And just want to relay my personal journey, just to help you see what that was. I don't see this room, so I cannot get a sense of the audience right now. But I'm assuming all of you are very young and possibly the same age as I was when I initially started. contributing to the Lanka Linux user group. We had a good community of people where we did a lot of activities around hackathons, code fests, and various conferences. And we also, along with a really tight, like-minded group of people, we built, a Linux distribution called Taproban, and subsequently started contributing to Debian as a maintainer in 2007. Worked on a few projects. That's where I met Nibe. He helped me get started there, and then a few more years down the line, and a few more contributions. In 2020, I've onboarded as a Debian developer, and I maintain a couple of packages, Watchman, Corn Shell, and a few tools like Patat, ProcDump. I'm currently maintaining at Debian. And as part of that, quite personally, as I was maintaining Corn Shell, I realized this is really hard. Sometimes you realize maybe you're a little bit out of your depth, right? But then it's at that point you've got to persevere and then look around you and see, hey, if these guys are doing it, if these other guys are doing it, why can't I do it, right? And you got to, that'll become a motivation for you, right? And it help you kind of understand the areas that you need to improve on, and push you in that direction. For instance, in the Corn Shell, we are maintaining an extremely old but rich code base. This was created back in the 1980s by Dr. David Korn of AT&T Bell Labs. And so you would have heard, when it comes to shells, you've got a couple of very important shells. You've got the bash shell, you've got the C shell, and you've got the Corn Shell. And so I feel very privileged to be working on the Corn Shell, even though it was a challenge initially. But I've seen some of the developers who are contributing and working on it, and I realize I'm completely in awe of the level of skill that some of these developers have, and it also kind of pushes me a little bit to kind of keep upping my game. I think that's the fundamental thing I want you guys to get out of it, which is, when you work alongside people and you try to become better, it helps you kind of find areas that you need to kind of improve on. So fundamentally, it's all about self-improvement. It's all about figuring out your own gaps so that you can bridge them, you can build them, and you can start leveling up, right? So fundamentally, it's all about that. Then in 2021, at the height of the pandemic, we built a small operating system, a toy operating system, I would say a hobbyist operating system called Odyssey, and made it open source. If you're interested in operating systems and how they work, feel free to dive into this code. I'm sure I would have made a bunch of mistakes on this. So if you find anything like that, fork this repository and make a contribution. I'm happy to pull them in, right? And feel free to do that. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is to show it's a long journey. It's not a one-off journey, but it's been a very fruitful journey for me personally and individually. I've learned a lot over the years. I've had a lot of fun doing this. So it's a great hobby to have, and much of the skills I built along the way have directly translated into my professional life. Prior to ConceptVines, I spent 18 years at Virtusa, where we built large teams, focusing on product engineering, on innovations, and so on. And much of the skills I built during my open source contribution days became directly usable. And there were many times where, had I not done that, or had I not been involved in open source communities, it would have been lacking. I would have had one less skill in my toolbox. So, so definitely, just think about how to make the best out of the experiences you get, and contributing to these open source communities is one way to do that. Since I'm close to Debian, I want to talk about a couple of ways where you can contribute to a couple of projects. One is Debian. How would you get started with Debian? So I've listed out a few things you want to do some initial reading on. You got to read the Debian new maintenance guide. read the developer's reference, understand the social contract and the free software guidelines, right? Then you got to generate a GPG key, and you got to get it signed by at least 2 Debian developers. I can certainly help as one of the developers. And but this will require you to work with the communities, to network with people, and build the kinds of relationships you're going to need in order to get there. Then you've got to join some of these mailing lists and work on either a package or on a team. So read up on some of the material that I've linked to from here. And you can sign up at Mentors and get your work that you've done on your packages sponsored by someone in the community. And then contribute consistently and build relationships and continue to push yourself and get integrated into the community. And then go through the new maintainer process, whereby you can become a maintainer and/or developer as you progress down the line. Next, I will talk a little bit about how you want to also figure out if you'd like to contribute to the Linux kernel. This has been one of the areas for me for the last 20 years, and I can still consider myself very new, very novice at this, but I've been persevering. And one of the ways you can get started with some of these things is read a few books, right? And I've listed a few books that are informative and useful on this subject. And I would recommend that you track the Linux kernel mailing list, but note that the Linux kernel mailing list is a high volume mailing list. So sometimes it might be a little bit daunting to directly track it. Instead, what you would probably want to do is subscribe to something like LWN, which is an excellent source if you're an engineer. It'll have a lot of material related to a lot of interesting topics, if you're a hardcore developer. So I would suggest subscribing to LWN. That would be a good way to start learning about some of these topics, build knowledge on those areas, and slowly progress to the point where you can then begin to start contributing, right? And how you get started with it is you just download the code, you tweak it, you play with a few kernels, apply some patches, try different types of configurations, right? You do a little bit of that, and then figure out, what changes you want to do, right? Maybe through, to fix a defect, or maybe make a small enhancement, and figure out, a change that you'd like to do, make the change, run your check style scripts to make sure everything looks good, prepare your patch, and then send it off to a mailing list, to a maintainer who maintains that subsystem. Now, before you do that, you should read some of the guidelines around the best ways, what are the practices you should follow when contributing to the kernel, because sometimes the kernel community can be a daunting place, and there could be folks with very little patience. So, but I want you to not get offended, or not even get put off by those things. You got to persevere. So, but you have to also make sure that whatever you contribute looks good. You've tested, you've validated, you've made sure you've followed the coding style documentation, and gone through those prerequisites prior to submitting it into the mailing list in the first place, to prevent any pushback. Once you do, you've got your first contribution, and that will be a great achievement. So I think if you're interested in operating systems and being able to get involved in some high level projects that are used around the world on a day-to-day basis and make a big impact, this is a good place to do that. So hopefully this is of use for you, and somebody will get inspired to do this. To wrap up, we're hiring, and we're looking for great engineers, and then we are hiring across the board. So if you think you have what it takes to be a good engineer, and who's able to work on different technologies, maybe even be able to pick up new skills rapidly and fast, drop your CV to us at careers@conceptvines.com, and we'd happy to have a chat with you. And even if you do not know certain technologies, if you have the kind of attitude where you're able to quickly learn, pick up skills, that's what we're looking for. And we are, as a company, we are working a lot with cutting edge startups in product engineering, in building, in working in the Web3 space. We're strategically growing a lot of competency internally in terms of blockchain, in terms of Web3, in terms of working with cutting edge cloud platforms. So feel free to reach out to us if you want to play in that space, right? And of course, we pride ourselves in building high-performing engineering teams who go after very interesting challenges. So if you want to be part of those challenges, reach out. We're happy to talk to you. And in closing, thank you for this opportunity. Really appreciate you giving us the time to kind of talk to you about this. This is an area of very personal interest for me, and I hope this was useful to you, and you found some benefit from this. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to clarify, help answer, maybe even point you in the right directions if you need any help from us as you progress in your open source journey. All the best, and thank you.